Hey, wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 56. I know I say this every single week, but I can't believe the amount of information flow that happens within 1 week right now. If you're new to the show, my name is Simon Dixon. Welcome to Bitcoin Hard Talk. This is where we do hard talk about hard money, and we go into this week in Bitcoin, in macro, and geopolitics, and we bring it all together so that we can support each other in transitioning to a world that I believe will be coming dominated as the resistance movement against the central banksters, Bitcoin, and artificial intelligence, and central bank digital currencies. And I would like to share you through that journey. So we break it down into 3 sections. We cover Bitcoin, we cover macro, and we cover geopolitics. But let's just give you the 10-foot overview over what happened this week, and we're going to be digging deeper in so that you can decide how you position yourself and protect yourself in this fast transition that we are going through. So the banksters at the Fed, they decided to hand Kamala Harris a gift and give her 50 basis points Fed rate cut in order to take the American economy into the next phase of Ponzi economics. We had a second attempt at the assassination of Trump. We had a X space where Trump and his family shared their vision for the World Liberty Financial project that they covered in an X space. We covered that last week, and I'll make sure you understand what was changed there and my skepticism towards the project as well. We also had exploding pages one day. The next day we had exploding walkie-talkies. And the third day we had outright bombing within Lebanon as Israel has now expanded the war to Lebanon in the Middle East without actually declaring war or taking credit for the crimes that Mossad and the absolute terrorism that was committed. So with that said, we need to figure out how that affects Bitcoin, how that affects macro, and make sure that we are 5,000 steps ahead of the geopolitical situation. So without further ado, let's jump straight in. So firstly, welcome to the Kingdom of Bhutan, who announced their Bitcoin Strategic Reserve Asset Strategy. They aren't doing it in a similar way to El Salvador, but they have accumulated through a dollar cost average a position where both El Salvador and the Kingdom of Bhutan combined have 18,900 Bitcoin worth approximately, well, the price has gone up now, but approximately before the rally, $1.1 billion. That is $1.1 billion chipping away at the debt slavery from the International Monetary Fund and the Federal Reserve and its proxies. Interestingly, for those of you that don't know, the Kingdom of Bhutan was actually one of the creditors in the Celsius bankruptcy. I would love to understand what happened there through those Israeli shell companies that scammed billions of dollars of 650,000 victims, and Mizhinsky, who came out this week and said he didn't know anything was going to happen. And nobody should have been an idiot enough to listen to him, the puffery defense. He actually managed to even figure out how to scam the Kingdom of Bhutan, because in the 90-day period before the withdrawal, the Kingdom of Bhutan withdrew about $100 million worth of Bitcoin and crypto, and the Celsius estate is currently suing the Kingdom of Bhutan. So as a creditor, I would, full disclosure, be a recipient and beneficiary of that. But at the same time, I congratulate the Kingdom of Bhutan for freeing themselves from the International Monetary Fund and building their own Bitcoin Strategic Reserve assets. We had President of El Salvador, President Bukele. He came out and he said that El Salvador will no longer require external debt financing. And the budget has been achieved to secure financial independence. Now, We know that there is strategic partnerships with China and the Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, they were launching some of those projects last time I was in El Salvador. But there is a difference between the China way of doing things through the Belt and Road Initiative and now its future projects, and the IMF way. The IMF way uses economic hitman to exert terrorism and regime changes in order to repossess all those assets when you do a partnership with them, and all the money ends up back in America anyway. Now, I'm no adverse to any good faith capitalism and countries trading with each other, but China so far has been doing it in a different way. It doesn't end up with your government being detoppled. But just in case China does have a plan for that, Bukele is building the El Salvador Bitcoin strategic reserve asset, and eventually buying one Bitcoin every single day can put El Salvador in a position, because it is ahead of the curve, where it has an asset held by the government and not the central bank. So El Salvador freed itself, not quite freed itself, it freed itself from its own central bank, which got it into civil war and debt slavery with the International Monetary Fund, and being taken over by gangsters, which El Salvador and President Bukele had to reverse, had to overthrow the entire government and make Bitcoin legal tender in order to progress and chuck out the banksters. But eventually those Bitcoins should be worth a sum if the 4-year cycle continues historically, ever since I've been involved, and the entire history of Bitcoin. And it seems to be playing out like clockwork, exactly as we describe every week on Bitcoin Hard Talk. And so congratulations to El Salvador for showing the world it still is dependent upon the dollar and Bitcoin as a medium of exchange and legal tender. So, but people can protect themselves from the inflation of the Federal Reserve as it looks to fully take over constitutional America with its $35 trillion debt Ponzi scheme, plus the $250 trillion of additional debt that America is in with future obligations, ever since the Federal Reserve occupied America and took it into war after war after war, and bailout after bailout after bailout, which makes up all of that debt, which was used for the benefit of its shareholders, which are the banks that claim they meet every single time in the FOMC meeting and pretend that they're trying to sort out inflation and employment when they're optimizing the economy for its shareholders, which is the banks and the money cartels as well. Anyway, there was also an interesting article that I saw this week on the relationship between the yen and the Japanese carry trade, and also how that affected ETH staking. So for those of you familiar, I have a savings bucket, which is Bitcoin. And I also have a smaller investment bucket where I do things that try and make me more Bitcoin for having a higher risk. I take my ETH staking and I convert the stake into Bitcoin as a mechanism for generating income as one of my strategies. Just an example. But it was interesting to watch how ETH staking was affected by the different types of rewards rates as a result of the Japanese carry trade that happened. And so this paper came out. I had a little read. I'll summarize some of it for you right now. But it was essentially showing you how global financial shifts can influence the staking returns, which, if you're following a strategy like mine, can convert to more Bitcoin depending on the Bitcoin ETH, Japanese yen, and all sorts of those different types of things as well. So as a reminder, the way that the Japanese carry trade works, if you are new to the show and you haven't been watching my previous episodes, you essentially borrow from the Central Bank of Japan, which has a low rate, because the Bank of Japan was set up by the banking cartel after World War II in order to create a Japanese yen debt-based Ponzi scheme, when prior to that, during the war period, it actually had a debt-free financial system, and oil embargoes were used in order to drive Japan into the world wars in order to fund the military industrial complex, which led to a bunch of the debt that is on the balance sheet right now. Well, the Bank of Japan, essentially, you borrow the money from the Bank of Japan at 0% interest. That creates inflation within Japan because people are using those 0% interest loans and then using it to acquire assets, which created a stock market bubble. It creates inflation, and it creates the financial apartheid that you see within the UK, America, and everyone else that has a debt-based Ponzi scheme, fiat currency, central bank, where those that own assets significantly benefit from the money printing, and those that don't own the assets end up on the wrong side of a financial apartheid, deep in debt, and eventually ending where in a cost of living crisis where they just can't afford to live in the way that the system was actually designed. And so what they would do is they would borrow at 0% interest, and then they would invest in assets, whether it be stocks or bonds, that were paying a higher rate. And so ever since the escalation of NATO that led to the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, because it was no longer a military neutral zone, as was the agreement in the negotiations at the end of the Cold War, they had to hike rates very suddenly, which broke the banking system in US in 2023 and led to those banks having to take on another $650 billion of debt. Well, when they hiked those rates, the US started paying higher amounts. And so therefore people were borrowing from Japan for free, hedging those currency risks with derivatives and lending it to the US government, which tied the Bank of Japan and the Federal Reserve together in a debt-based Ponzi scheme, where essentially if Japan wants to control inflation, they have to raise interest rates, and that makes the Japan carry trade worse, affects the US stock market, and then they use some kind of financial weapon of mass destruction to inflict more inflation upon the Japanese people, so that those that want their stocks and real estate to go up in America can benefit from the financial apartheid in these interconnected debt-based Ponzi schemes. Well, anyway, the Japan carry trade was a way of profiting from the difference of being able to borrow from free and then use derivatives to hedge the risks. And one interesting thing is, this is speculation, but when we saw Sam Bankman-Fried, which was the scam artist that created the FTX Ponzi scheme, he actually made his original wealth using the Japan carry trade, as my speculation, in order to arbitrage Bitcoin between Korea and Japan and take advantage of what was known as the kimchi premium. But I reckon that financing and the ability to get from Japan to Korea may have been done and financed through the Japanese carry trade. And that was when he suddenly came along and just was implanted into our industry, and everyone thought he would like been here all along, and created the FTX Ponzi scheme, which ended up blowing up with all the other financial institutions when we had the coup of Binance by the US government, and then Operation Choke Point 2.0 that led to handing over the centralized financial companies to BlackRock and all the other financial institutions that were able to get access to banking after Operation Choke Point 2.0. And so SBF was clearly a part of that operation, but I think it was originally the financing, is my speculation, probably came from the Japanese carry trade in order to make that money that gave when FTX was later created very fast. Well, anyway, when the Japanese carry trade unwind, we had an episode of Bitcoin Hard Talk called Black Monday. The ETH essentially had 26% sell-off during that Black Monday period as well. So it crashed by about 26%. And there was a hedge fund called Jump Crypto, which sold right up, leading to Japan Black Monday, because Bitcoin, ETH, and the crypto market have become a leading indicator because they're open 24/7. And so you can sell off your risk on exposure in the Bitcoin, ETH, and crypto market if you're a crazy trader. And that can so often front run what happens when the market's opened. So Jump Crypto had to dump about $350 million worth of ETH. But at the same time, the unwinding of the Japanese carry trade led to significantly higher gas fees. And so if you are staking ETH, then you benefit from those additional higher gas fees. But there is also a boost mechanism that happens in ETH staking for those that are running validators, which is called, what is it called? I always forget the name, MEV or something. I don't want to go through the technicals because it's so boring. But those that were using ETH staking to earn more Bitcoin on Bank to the Future, the company I co-founded, they got a massive boost during that time. And they were able to convert that to more Bitcoin if they were following that strategy, or compound it for more ETH as well. And so it was really interesting to watch how as you have the unwinding in the traditional market, that led to higher rewards, higher gas fees, and therefore benefited those that are validating and staking those transactions. The report showed that approximately 6,000 ETH was distributed as a result of this whole reversal of the Japan carry trade as well. Okay, all right. Well, that was, I thought, an interesting story as well. So we'll watch that further as well as we see how yield is affected in the crypto market as well. Now, talking about the crypto market and yield, on Monday this week, we had Donald Trump, after his second assassination attempt, turn up to the X space with his family and various other members. And last week, we covered the whole World Liberty Financial Project. So we got confirmation in the space. Some of the details that I reported that were rumored from Coindesk weren't correct, according to them. Either they pivoted as a result of the negativity, or it was just reported incorrectly in the first place. So as a reminder, for those of you that haven't watched the episode, they're doing three things, and these really create big problems if it's connected to a presidential campaign at the same time. I won't go over all those things as well, but he's basically, Trump's family, through World Liberty Financial, are creating three different things. The first is a treasury-backed stablecoin, which means that they would need to recreate the infrastructure of a company I'm a shareholder in, like Circle, which requires lots of regulations, lots of attack vectors, and lots of three-letter agencies that will probably be politicized in order to make sure this didn't happen, just like when Facebook tried to launch their stable coins. The second part of what they're launching is called a DeFi platform. And so this is when you have the ability to lock up in a smart contract your cryptocurrency, and then you can borrow against it some stable coins rather than having to sell your crypto. That may have tax advantages, and you can do it all through a self-enforcing smart contract. And those that want to lend out their crypto, it can all be done through a smart contract. And that is a DeFi platform. And I covered last week some of the technology that was being used, different hacks that have been involved in the technology. So that creates another attack vector. But they're also launching a token, and that's the most controversial part of it. They called it a governance token. And that governance token means that those who own the token get to have a say in the future of the project. They confirmed that the token economics that they're going to do 63% of the token sold in an ICO, 2017 style. Maybe they're using the Ripple cases where it was ruled that XRP, the token's not a security, but doing institutional sales of that token is a security. And it confirmed that in the case of US investors, it will only be sold to accredited investors. And then there's an exemption called Reg S, which means that non-US investors can purchase, but there are all the non-US regulations you have to comply with at the moment, which I'm pretty sure are not going to be factored into the equation. They confirmed that everyone will pay the same price. There will be no venture capital or VC discounts. 17% will be given for user rewards. That's a red flag. Normally that means they're subsidizing the yield, which always calls into question the model, but we shall see. And then 20% is going to be used by the team to compensate the team. And the phrase that they used, make sure I get this right, We want to return to equal financial opportunity to Americans. Unfortunately, regulations don't allow for that, and I do forecast this project is going to be a really bad idea to be connected with anyone that is running a presidential campaign or gets elected as the president as well. I covered all of that a lot more previously. As I said, the governance token is only going to be available to accredited investors initially, then likely it will go on an exchange. Just as an indication, only 14% of America qualify as an accredited investor, and about 10 to 11% of them are based upon being a net worth of $1 million plus. And there's other ways of qualifying for an accredited investor. So even if you start with the goals, we have seen this before a million times, the 3-4 letter agencies come after you. There is rampant speculation, and nothing ends up, creating the same types of things with these platform tokens. We've seen it so many times. So I think it is a bad move. I think Trump and the Republican administration should focus on what RFK presented in consultation with the Bitcoin community, with the Bitcoin strategic reserve asset, and not get distracted by this massive attack vector that most likely won't achieve any of the goals. And I'll continue to address those concerns around this project anyway. What else did we get this week? So yeah, this week as well, in the Bitcoin side, the founder of Binance, CZ, he is due to be released from prison. It's going to be on September the 29th. And the thing you need to be aware of on that deal is that, whereas Sam Bankman-Fried got approximately 20 years, Maszynski is facing up to 115 years in the January case in 2025. CZ only got 4 months, even though there was some very serious allegation. The reason is because he negotiated that the US could take over the compliance side and have a compliance monitor for approximately 3 years. I addressed concerns about this and called it a US coup. And we got that confirmed when Israel started contacting Binance and started shutting down and freezing everybody's assets as part of a financial weapon of mass destruction in the Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people, and started expanding that further and further to neighboring regions as well. I'm sure we will see that expand to Lebanon right now. So be very careful. You need to understand self-custody. You need to recognize that Binance right now did have a US coup. And so therefore it is exerting the policies and getting Palestinians right now to beg Israel while they're executing a genocide to unfreeze their funds. And everyone I've spoken to is not supporting them in unfreezing their funds, even though they have no connection to any groups that they classify as groups you can't deal with as well. On the corporate side, we had an announcement from Elon's SpaceX after their successful mission it confirmed that it holds currently, in the last disclosure, 8,285 Bitcoin worth approximately $500 million, and that's gone up since the rally, on its balance sheet. At the same time, there were lots of FUD events around internet infrastructure. And the reason this is a Bitcoin story is because I've always said it is a long, important vector that we need to work on in order to make sure that Bitcoin functions and is useful to everybody, even if the internet gets taken out. And so we had satellites that operate nodes and can allow Bitcoin to function without the internet. And we also had announcements when there was a threat on the internet, or a threat being portrayed in the way that the Western media want you to be portrayed. And so there was news that Russia was essentially threatening to cut the West's internet. As we know, all accusations from NATO are normally confessions as well. And there are always false flag operations to make you think that is what's happening. Now, this is not to say that Russia wouldn't weaponize the internet if this were to escalate. But we also know that you can't take the first sign of what's happening as well. But NATO said that Russia has been mapping underneath the sea, basically. Okay, anyway, hopefully that fixed itself as well. Well, NATO came out and basically said that Russia has been mapping under the sea, trying to cut off internet cables. And it is really scary if you think about it, that our internet that we're so dependent upon really relies upon cables under the sea. Everything comes back to hardware in the end. And they announced that they believe that Russia is planning such an attack. And so, you know, if they were doing that, that would have devastating effects. We know that. But it would have devastating effects for everybody. But maybe, you know, that's the thing that we need to concern ourselves with as well. But always remember, if it happens, there is one organization that blew up Nord Stream pipeline and exerted terrorist attack in order to destroy the European economy, where Germany is deep in recession right now and cutting rates as a result of America blowing up Nord Stream pipeline so that they could start servicing more of their natural gas to Germany, and destroyed their country through an act of financial weapon of mass destruction terror as well. So as a result of that anyway, it's an important thing for us at the Bitcoin community to make sure that we get more satellites up there. We did get the launch of various satellites up there, so Bitcoin can still function without the internet. It can still back up records, but it's making sure that those records work. And also Elon Musk came out and said, even if Putin did shut down the internet, he thinks Starlink would still work across the West as well. But as a result of all of these escalations and all of this rising geopolitical tension, we are seeing gold reach new all-time highs again. And so that is normally a signal when the Fed is cutting rates at the rate it is right now for political means. Gold is reaching new all-time highs, and we get 2 assassination attempts of the presidential candidate. This is normally trying to signal us that something's going on, and we had the Bitcoin rally as well as a result of that as well. Another thing that was quite interesting is we saw on the blockchain, because we can see those transactions, we don't know who it is, but some of the very early wallets that were connected to right near the Satoshi time as well, 250 Bitcoin worth approximately $16 million. It was mined in January 2009. So that was right at the beginning of Bitcoin. These wallets moved and it had zero impact on the market. So you always get this FUD story of what happens if some of the original Satoshi mined coins move. Now, this wasn't one of those wallets, but it was one from that era. And so we get another example that some of those January wallets from January 2009, it moved that amount of Bitcoin and no one even noticed. No one really cared. The original owner of those wallets, just so you know, they hodled those Bitcoins before it was even a price. So in January 2009, there was no price for Bitcoin. So it mined those Bitcoins, which it got at a price of $0. It would have been on their computer when the cost of mining them would have been absolutely tiny, to where we are today. And when they sent them over and when they moved them, the price was approximately $63,000. So that is 63 million% return on 250 Bitcoin. That is what you call a legend. And it turns out that they had access to the key all along, but we don't know who it actually is as well. And so those are really interesting things as well. We had a wave of announcements that traditional financial institutions are now launching their Bitcoin options exchange, their Bitcoin exchanges, that banks are getting into Bitcoin as well. And so the operation where TradFi is now getting into Bitcoin is happening in full force. And so our sole job at this point is the banks and financial institutions are out there presenting to everybody why they should own Bitcoin. But now our job is to make sure that people understand they should own it in self-custody, because there will be a 2-tiered Bitcoin system. those that are held in custody by banks for financial products, and those that are held in self-custody. And anybody that's been on any of my educational stuff, on free stuff on simondixon.com, you'll know that one of the first thing we do in, for example, the Bitcoin Wealth Builder program is make sure that you get yourself set up with a self-custody so that you can understand. Now, you can start hedging your risks in case you lose your key. And, I do risk manage by using different storage methods so that no matter what happens, there are some Bitcoin, even if it goes wrong there. And I don't mind using it as a risk management tool. But self-custody is something that everybody needs to learn. There was also interesting announcement on the corporate side from MicroStrategy. He did a interview on Saifedean Ammous, the author of the Bitcoin Standards podcast, and a lot of time was talking around Bitcoin yield, Bitcoin collateralized loans. We know that Cantor Fitzgerald made an announcement that they're going to be taking Bitcoin as collateral and then issuing loans, while Trump was announcing the DeFi project. The centralized TradFi players are also starting to look into this market. But I'm starting to get a little bit of hint, and this is speculation, that maybe that's MicroStrategy's strategy, as it were, to eventually get into the collateralized lending market. Now, that is a hugely regulated field, and you would see license applications and things like that. But a little bit of speculation on the Bitcoin side that we may get a return from the TradFi players and the DeFi players to the very same thing that was used to manipulate by the scammers like Majinsky and SBF in 2022 in order to take and manipulate the market. Now, it doesn't matter, because if you follow my whole approach of valuing your wealth in Bitcoin, you'll know that the lower the price goes, the better, and you play the 4-year cycle, and the 4-year cycle is yet to fail, and it seems to continue to play it out for 2024 and through into 2025, through into the next halving cycle as well. But by valuing your wealth in Bitcoin, you don't mind about the manipulation, because you can buy more Bitcoin with your fiat currency as you exit central banking by owning it in self-custody, where you can hold your Bitcoin without a bank. You can hold your Bitcoin without the government telling you whether you can spend it. And you can protect yourself from inflation by central bankers and the money printers through its fixed money supply, and having that supply that no one can change. Okay, so let's move into now the macro section, and hopefully my computer will stay up. I've got like the most expensive Mac money you can buy, 65 grand I spend on this thing. And the cheaper Mac was much better. I've got some real complaints as we move into these AI smartphones, which seems to be reports of people having their phones blowing up as well. I miss the Steve Jobs days as well. Still a big fan of the product, but been having some issues as well. Right, so on the macro side, the big news was obviously that the Federal Reserve cut rates by 50 basis points instead of 25 basis points. This is the first cut since COVID. And so this has been a 4-year period in the making. They increased rates in order to try and control what they called transitory inflation that turned out to be rampant inflation that blew up the US banking system and led to the bank run in 2023. And then the Fed had to bail out all those banks. And now we got all this billions of dollars of unrealized losses on the bank's balance sheet. But now they're saying inflation is under control just before a political election, when we know that the financial apartheid is causing severe financial conditions for those that are on the wrong side of the financial apartheid. And this was a gift to making the economy look better ahead of the election and to serve the purpose of FOMC, which isn't about controlling inflation and employment. It is about servicing the special interests of those shareholders, which are the banks and the money cartels that occupied America and implemented unconstitutional money into America all those years ago, and has created 20 recessions, multiple pumps and dumps, and given the American government the ability to fund wars while intelligence agencies create false flag operations and covert regime changes to make you think that America is exporting democracy, but you are in fact paying through inflation for the war and creating global terrorism all around the world, which is bringing us into the state of affairs we are right now. But this was a gift for Kamala Harris to make the economy look better after a second assassination attempt of Trump. And we can guess what these types of things used to. The US Senator, which is fully bought and paid for, Elizabeth Warren, by the bank lobby that doesn't want you to be able to own your own Bitcoin, she was lobbying, saying it must be 75 basis points so we can pump a democratic Ponzi scheme led by the Federal Reserve, which really controls the system and gets to dictate through the CIA who is the next president anyway. But Elizabeth Warren said we should cut it to 0.75%. She's basically propping up the banking Ponzi scheme because her campaign finance comes from the banking lobby, which is not serving the interest of the American people, and making sure that she is deluding people into thinking that the money laundering doesn't happen through the banking system and that people are doing it through Bitcoin, when all the research has showed that creating an immutable record on a blockchain of your money laundering probably ain't a good idea. But anyway, she's fighting against self-custody, against the interest of Americans. So please fight for your constitutional rights. Please fight for freedom of speech. It's the most important thing, so that we can make sure that we get to the truth, because there can be no peace without truth, rather than these agendas by those that benefit from war, funding goons like Elizabeth Warren in order to lobby for 0.75% to pump a Ponzi scheme and keep the debt-based Ponzi going a little bit longer and make those that own all the assets happy at the expense of those that are being shafted by the system. Essentially, she is a product of the banking lobby. Follow the money and you will find out about that. We had some news on the Apple side. So for those that have been watching Bitcoin Hard Talk, you'll know the Berkshire Hathaway sold a massive chunk of their Apple shares. So Berkshire Hathaway, which seems to have forward information about most of the trends, and because their position sizes are so significant, it takes a long time for them to get out of their position. But they've been unwinding their Apple position. And so the finances came out around Apple stock right now, and the pre-orders for the iPhone AI phone were down approximately 16% on that as well. Now, the important thing to remember here is, why might that be? Well, it might just be a short-term trend. It might be fatigue in buying new upgraded iPhones. It might also be by the fact that some of them have been blowing up as a result of those AI chips. And it might also be a fact that although there is obviously privacy built into that, and there is a good track record, but once you put AI in there, there's probably some hesitancy around what people are doing with that data. And what we have seen is that these phones and devices, if you get on the wrong side of the proof of weapons network, can be used as bombs. And we'll go a little bit deeper into that in the geopolitical situation at the moment. But remember, those chips that are in those iPhone 16s relate to the geopolitical situation because they are 100% dependent upon the chips that are manufactured in Taiwan. And Taiwan is 100% dependent upon the commodities that are uniquely come from China. And so the proof of weapons network, if it wants to create economic turmoil, then it can continue having a policy of sanctioning Taiwan, which is what America is doing right now, in order to make sure that the chips don't get to China, which would force China to want to reunify with Taiwan, and Taiwan would have to accept it because they're 100% dependent upon the chips, and those chips are 100% dependent on the top stocks in America. And so you can see that this is totally not in America's interest to be acting in this way, but the warmongers in the NATO expansion that want World War III are making sure that these things are happening. And so as a result of the warmongering, you actually saw Mike Pompeo came out today and said that they want to they want to backstep. No, we'll cover that in the geopolitical section as well. Let's stick to macro, jumping around too much as well. But China responded anyway by sanctioning some of the US companies that were weaponizing Taiwan and the military industrial complex as well. And so we're starting to get this sanction war, which is always a precursor. A trade war goes to a sanction war, and then a sanction war leads to an embargo. And this is what we saw that drove Japan into the war last time as well, when the military industrial complex for profits is looking to destroy economic activity for a certain region in order to make sure that the war machine keeps going for the profits of those war machine stocks. Also, I talked about these exploding devices and this chaos that was happening. We'll cover more in the geopolitical section. But essentially, the devices, the pages that were exploding that were used in order to create absolute chaos across Lebanon ended up, being, they actually came from and were manufactured in Taiwan. And so that had a big, problem. And the Taiwanese company immediately came out and said that they're going to start suing Israel. But the Taiwanese company is going to be suing Israel, either trying to cover their back for that. But there was a real circle of trying to figure out what was going on here. It was alleged a Mossad operation. Israel didn't take responsibility for it. It's just been staying silent. But in the geopolitical section, we'll go a little bit deeper into the announcement that it made. But also that went into connecting to a Hungarian company. And then there was also a German company that may have intercepted. And then it went back to a shell company, which was linked back to Israel. So always follow the money in these things. Don't follow the media, follow the money. Don't follow the politicians' words, follow the money. And that's what I've always been doing. And it seems to always work for me in trying to figure out what things are really happening aside from the propaganda as well. Okay, so we also had, this is also a warning sign for me. When you get the traditional financial players like JP Morgan that benefit from war because they're one of the shareholders of the Federal Reserve and the war machine that pushes intelligence agencies into doing these non-governmental escalations. And when one of the net beneficiary banks starts to warn about the US economic crisis, you start to have to pay attention, because to me, that means that when you're following the money, they're starting to prepare and hedge for the next system. And so this really reminds me of exactly where the US was pre-World War I and where the UK was pre-World War I as well. And so at this time, pre-World War I, the Bank of England and the money cartel, they'd had two failed attempts to take over the American economy and get the government deep in debt when two central banks were shut down. But they got the third one, which was the Federal Reserve. And since then, they've managed to get the American economy into the debt that we always talk about, the $35 trillion of debt that is taking and bankrupting the US economy right now. Well, this is exactly what they did to the UK prior to World War I. Essentially, they launched the Federal Reserve in 1913. Shareholders included the banking cartel, the Bank of England. They took the model that was used in order to bankrupt the UK government. And after that, it was negotiations that were happened in order to escalate. And this is when we had the birth of Zionism as well, which has nothing to do with Judaism. They just weaponized Judaism by a group of atheists that wanted to have their own jurisdiction so that they could ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and also have a jurisdiction for pushing forward these partnerships between the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, Mossad, CIA, MI5, and have their own jurisdiction in order to execute these different operations. And so the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 came through, and after pushing UK and all of these different types of evidence is coming through, negotiating a deal with the Zionist entity deep into the war, this is when Churchill and Balfour gave the Balfour Declaration in 1917 that promised Israel or Palestine a jurisdiction in Palestine. It was promised to the Rothschild family, which are the same shareholders that created the Bank of England, or didn't create the Bank of England, took over the Bank of England through financial terrorism, bankrupted the UK government, forced it into pushing the final bit of squeeze into the GBP Ponzi scheme that was created through the Bank of England, and then negotiated, when they bankrupted the UK government, all of these deals, like declaring Israel to Palestine in exchange for building the next Ponzi scheme. So they got the Federal Reserve. Now they needed America to join the war. So right after the Balfour Declaration, America joined the effort of World War I, and the debt-based Ponzi scheme started to build the $35 trillion of debt that America is in right now, through the same Rothschild banking cartels, and the period in which they had the negotiations in 2018, in which basically they had to transfer all of the gold, where through reparations, the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had to assume all of the debt, and then the debt was priced in gold, and this led to a transfer of the gold over to the Federal Reserve debt-based Ponzi scheme, and pushed the German debt-based Ponzi scheme into a hyperinflationary cycle. And then that was met with a war between central bankers, because the Germans at the time created a debt-free monetary system, arrested the Rothschilds, shut down the debt-based Ponzi scheme that caused the hyperinflation, and then this led to World War II and a complete rewriting of history. And then obviously the Holocaust, that was then the justification in order to get more and more people over to join the effort with the IDF in order to ethnically cleanse and genocide the people in Palestine, which is what we're all experiencing right now. But anyway, the reason that this reminded me of this is because they essentially bankrupted the UK government. The Bank of England was the net benefit, and its shareholders were the net beneficiaries of all of the debt. They then used intelligence agencies to get covert operations to push for World War I and World War II. And then they transitioned the power network over to the Federal Reserve, made sure that the Bank of England was also a net beneficiary through its shareholding and dividends, and obfuscated all of that process, and then got the debt-based Ponzi scheme moving as well. They were able to use gold prices because a significant amount of gold was confiscated through all of these different colonial empires. So America ended up with all of Britain's gold, which it stole from all the colonial expeditions that were funded by the Bank of England. That all ended up in America because they were the rising industrial power, and the Rothschilds and the Fed just essentially dumped England, and we had this slow decline of the Great British Pound from a world reserve currency with a rising world reserve currency, with the US dollar backed by the Ponzi scheme of the debt-based system of the Federal Reserve. But essentially, the Fed were the one that profited and escalated World War II. This also led to different operations like the Bolshevik Revolution, funded by the same central banking cartels, that replaced Russia, that had a debt-free monetary system, with the Soviet Union and the Communist Manifesto. And then the Cold War was about getting America deeper into debt, Russia, or the Soviet Union now, which took over Russia, deeper into debt. And then you had the whole Cold War that led to the Korean War, and also the Vietnamese War and all of the covert operations that took America deeper and deeper into a multi-trillion-dollar debt situation. And when that ended, you had to replace it with the next wars, which was there was an operation that was released where they were going to de-topple 7 countries in 5 years that would end with Iran. That was published on WikiLeaks, all of those documents, that was an operation. And so they had 65, America had 65 different covert operations to overthrow governments through a coup in Iran that led to a revolution, that led to a nuclear deal, and then allow Israel to be the sole nuclear power and everything we're suffering from right now. And so that getting to the point right now where America now is 130% debt to GDP, and it has pretty much got to the point of US bankruptcy, exactly where the UK was as well, in that type of operation. What did they need to do? Well, they needed to use deceit into pushing for World War I, World War II. Now they're using deceit in order to push for World War III. And so that would be a transition phase. And what do they do once the dollar and the Fed is not as useful? Well, they keep the Bank of England, they keep the Fed, and then they're able to replace it with the next financial system. And so in October, I've been covering the BRICS conference, which aims to create a central bank digital currency, let's call it, and hopefully it could resist against this. But I expect a massive struggle against Russia, China, India, South Africa, in order to replace some of those non-debt-based monetary systems that want to back it by gold with the debt-based system, so you can shovel those into wars by controlling the BRICS corridor as well. And so what I'm seeing right now, when I see things like JP Morgan is warning against the collapse of the US dollar, de-dollarization, sanctions, all that stuff, I look to what's happening, follow the money with the design of the BRICS currency. And I will be watching that very carefully. Why do you think Mike Pompeo comes out and says we're no longer following the peace negotiation with China, which was the one China policy, and they want to recognize Taiwan's independence? Because they want reunification. Why do you think NATO started to expand in what was meant to be the neutral zone between Europe and Russia in order to get peace after the Cold War? And that led to the aggression from Russia into Ukraine, and now almost 1 million Ukrainians dying, and more Russians as well, because they need to take over the Russian central banking system as well. Why do you think that we are being told that Israel is allowed to have illegal nukes, and Israel is allowed to expand with impunity and receive money that is printed by the Federal Reserve, that is creating inflation and a cost of living crisis in America, when they're not even able to protect their borders, and yet they're able to fuel the military industrial complex and sanction all of these countries? And when they have a nuclear deal, it gets torn up because Iran needs to react to the fact that Israel has illegal nukes that aren't inspected, and you have all those regime change to destabilize the region. It's because NATO wants to expand to the Middle East and expand to both West and East Asia as well. And that is the transfer of wealth. And that's why I believe you're seeing the rate cuts right now to fuel the final Ponzi scheme, with the intelligence agencies having decided who needs to go and be assassinated and who needs to get into power, in order to make sure that these different schemes drive us into World War III. And then they can change the BRICS corridor with the next useful currency. And so I will keep following that. And that's not a guarantee that they'll win, but I want people to understand the types of things that need to be looked at right now. So let's have a look at the BRICS corridor, what I know so far. Now, remember, as I covered the Trump project, I'll cover the BRICS project once more detail comes out. But what I do know is that it is announced, Russia announced that it is going to be 2 cryptocurrencies. One of them is going to be backed by the BRICS currency, which will be a basket of currencies and commodities based upon resources, and another stable coin backed by the yen. We also know that is going to be using, there's been previous announcements, mBridge. Now, mBridge is a technology that was created by the Bank for International Settlements. Who are the Bank for International Settlements? Well, the Bank for International Settlements was set up between the World War I and World War II era in order to facilitate that trade of Germans' gold and handing it over to the Federal Reserve System through reparations. And also the same system that was used to work with the IMF in order to create these different currencies and trades between gold before it moved to the Bretton Woods system after World War II. And it is a network of debt-based Ponzi schemes that use economic hitmen in order through terrorism take over and install central bank Ponzi schemes through loans across and all of the Rothschild banking system that came from the Bank of England that was implemented in the Fed and export that to 167 different countries. That's the institution that is creating the mBridge, and the mBridge is the technology that BRICS is meant to be using. To me, this sounds very suspicious. And by the way, this also was what led to the confiscation of Americans' gold. When FDR made gold ownership illegal, you had to trade it in for 20 cents and then 35 cents, if memory serves me right, dollars rather, traded in with the Fed. And it wasn't until the Lee Blanchard reforms in 1970 when Americans were able to own that gold. And now it's about $2,500, approaching $2,600 after buying it from you for $20. So central banks and debt-based Ponzi schemes, they like to create wars to get governments into debt. They like to pretend that they're controlling inflation and employment. They create 20 recessions in America. They use intelligence agencies to create terrorism all around the world, so that Americans can think that they're funding war. They're not funding war. They're exporting democracy around the world. And then as soon as the dollar's no longer useful anymore, they'll dump it, but they'll squeeze it for all it can. And then they'll start hedging to the next system and the next empire. This is why I believe that we are seeing very similar circumstances to what happened with the Bank of England to UK pre-World War I. And that's why I think you're seeing all these escalations right now. If you think the governments are in charge of all these decisions and these things make a difference, then you're not on the same page and you haven't been watching enough episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk. Man, I'm getting this computer issue as well. I tell you what, I'm going to do the geopolitical section fairly quick because I covered a bunch of it within the macro section. But what we're seeing right now is that Israel, which through Mossad is a part of this network of the central banking cartels, going into the West Bank and escalating the war there as well, even shooting an American in the face that was standing up for Palestinian right, nothing to do with the Hamas side. Hezbollah, the other side of the organization, has said, until there is Palestinian self-determination, we will engage in a tick for tack. So whatever Israel does to us, we will do back, and that will continue. And so Israel is now expanding that across to Lebanon. And within 3 days, they escalated it, whereby they did explosive device through those holding pages. This led to injuries by anyone that was in a car with somebody, anybody that was in a supermarket. We've got all these videos of not just military targets, but civilian casualties. And that took down the ambulance system and the hospital system by overwhelming it. The very next day, they took anyone that was holding walkie-talkies And then today, they decided that they would go and do strikes, take out some of the senior people in Hezbollah. And we're getting the reports right now that it was one of the 2,000-pound bombs that came from America, which has also led to civilian deaths and children casualties as well. We've seen this story before. Are we really going to fall for it again? And we have all the propaganda that comes from it as we see this. And now Hezbollah is going to have to retaliate. And there is a genuine struggle within Lebanon. There are many people that don't want nothing to do with these wars. And so they're in their internal struggle. Remember, Lebanon was already destroyed through currency devaluations. Economic hitmen at the IMF got it deep in debt. They then devalued the currency to destroy people's wealth. Rampant corruption meant that there was even reverse bank heists where people heisted the bank just to gain access to their own deposits, as it completely, through financial weapon of mass destruction, destroyed the Lebanese currency through IMF debt. And that was after, their struggles with Israel and civil wars and various other things. And we will, in future episodes, have to go deep into that politics as well. But I hope everyone's starting to see a repeatable pattern right now. And I hope everyone's starting to realize that we need to stay 1,000 steps ahead of us. And we also need to protect ourselves. The peaceful resistance is disabling and recognizing the enemy. The enemy has always been those that control the debt-based Ponzi scheme, that benefit from war, that use their money printing to create inflation and a financial apartheid, that then use their power in order to bribe our politicians. And when they can't bribe them, they use blackmail networks like we've seen with Epstein, like we're going to see with the connections with P. Diddy, like we're going to see with these Mossad CIA operations that come back to the original model that was created by the Bank of England and those that control this system and make us think that we are controlling it. You drain it by changing money, fix the world. I covered some of the different things that are being covered. I'm going to end a little bit early today because my computer's playing up, and it looks like hopefully Mossad has not used Pegasus in order to take control, so that I can't actually cover some of these things. There was also a couple of other bits of news as well. So it's going to be escalation. This is going in very aggressively into Lebanon, and it's going to lead to severe casualties, severe problems. We also had the story around the shooter, and the shooter, it turns out that the shooter, or the second attempt, and I don't really know exactly what to think here, but somebody wants Trump gone, or there are operations that are happening. But who was golfing with Trump at the time when the second assassination attempt happened? So firstly, the person that shot him could either be just some crazy guy that has been following the media too much, didn't realize that this whole thing of the operation that's happening in Ukraine is an escalation to World War III, and they don't understand that the Taiwan side is an escalation to try and push for reunification. And so the shooter was one of those people that has very suspicious connections to the CIA. There were lots of reports around all of the people that the very first person that he was following on Twitter. The feds took down the Twitter accounts, but people recorded them before they got to be taken down. And you could see very suspicious connections there. He was a pro-Ukrainian, pro-Taiwan fanatic because he's been watching too much media as well. But there was also the person that Trump was golfing with was a guy that Ryan Dawson covered in previous exposés and had deep connections to urban moving. And urban moving was the Mossad operation that was sent to America to document 9/11 before the towers went down. And that was what led to the dancing Israelis, and then a different group that then found the passport that made the operation complete as well. So that person It was Steve anyway. But what was crazy, after exposing that, that is the same guy that was speaking on the X space with Donald Trump that was launching the World Liberty Financial Project. I think a funder and co-founder, but one of the original people that were on that. Deep ties to urban moving, which was the Mossad operation that knew about 9/11 and very suspicious circumstances around that operation. When the 9/11 files, which Trump said he'd promised if he gets in power, and RFK promised that they would be delivered to you, you got to look at all the redacted names of the 7 Israelis that were arrested and detained for 7 months. And on my blog on simondixon.com, I shared a documentary which I'd encourage everybody to watch if they really want to get to the root of the problem, because here's what I have discovered. And without truth, we will never have peace. And people are all looking at the wrong enemies. And we need to defund the central banks. We gave America a Bitcoin strategic reserve asset strategy. And it seems like Trump instead is following a strategy that will make no difference to taking out the central banks. It's just a project that looks like you're creating a token that enriches the very same people. And so make sure the Bitcoin strategic reserve asset strategy happens. That's when you know that you are taking on the central bank. If you don't want to wait for governments to do it, then everyone needs to protect themselves, because every dollar exited from fiat currency and entered into Bitcoin is draining the money changers and the central banks swamp, which is taking us into these wartime escalations. And we are learning more and more and more about the truth. We know that Netanyahu's going to blame Iran for it. We know that there's going to be a false flag operation that justifies why you need to go to a war with Iran, just as Netanyahu told your Congress last time. And we know that there's also been escalations on the Yemeni side, which I think took out another American ships, which will lead to more escalations and this whole operation with more and more people learning, hopefully, if we can keep our freedom of speech, that we need to get on the right side of this. There was actually one of the missiles that was launched from Yemen, made its way into Tel Aviv, didn't lead to any death. So far, what we have seen is that they tend to be military targets, or they tend to be their version of sanctions, with creating disruption in the Red Sea, which affects the Suez Canal, affects the Egyptian economy, which is already destroyed by the IMF, going through hyperinflation, through its weapons of mass destruction that have been inflicted in it, in order to bribe those different regions in the Middle East that are controlled by dictators and kingdoms, and were implanted by these regime changes in order to exert the foreign policy that escalates us to World War III. And Abraham Accords was the epitomation, the exact event that led us to October the 7th, by sidestepping Iran and allowing Israel to continue with its illegal nukes and support the Greater Israel Project, which Trump has already taken $100 million from pro-Israel lobby in order to annex the West Bank and hand it over to the Greater Israel Project, which will cause carnage and escalate us further as well. So I'm just hoping that enough people see this, enough people exit with Bitcoin, and I think that's enough on the geopolitical side. So we are in absolute chaos. At the same time, Bitcoin managed to rally. We've had the Federal Reserve going for that additional pump and dump Ponzi. And we are learning who is meant to be in charge while the Fed rinses the US government for as much as it can, while it starts to plan its next move when it needs to ditch the dollar for however long they can make that pump and dump scheme go. that leads to rampant inflation and similar types of things as we saw with the UK side. So I'm sorry, it's pretty dark, but at the same time, I am very hopeful that we have now built the technology. We've got the freedom of speech. We'll keep it for as long as we can. I'll upload this in the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal, so we have backup of all this stuff. You can get copies, digital copies of my book, Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Government Go Bust. I shared how to take out a central banking Ponzi scheme before the word central bank digital currency existed. It was the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin. You can get a free digital copy of that in the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. And early next year, I'm going to be launching exactly specifically how to protect yourself from this, because I want as much Bitcoin in as many people's hands in self-custody, distributed to as many people so that they can protect themselves, and we can build as many resistance against central banking through peace, love, and unity, because Bitcoin is doing that. It's doing it for El Salvador. It's doing it for the Kingdom of Bhutan. It could have done it for America based upon the RFK strategy that our community gave, but instead Trump, for whatever reason, seems to be focused on a project that will only enrich that family and will cause lots of attack vectors. So call it out. Free America from the Fed. Otherwise, because the Fed is already planning its next move, and it will dump you just like it dumped Britain. And it only cares about escalation of war in order to fuel the military-industrial complex when you follow the money. Don't follow the people. Don't follow their words. Follow the money. And every single week, I'll make sure I do that. It looks like I'm going to have to try and get a new computer to make sure that this doesn't happen next time. But always remember, you're alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Some are going to get wrecked. Others are going to lose their lives. Others are going to do well. But I want as many people educated and empowered with peaceful Bitcoin to resist against the central banks, so that we can do it with peace, love, and unity. I'll see you this time next week for Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 57. Peace.